And all of God's people said, Amen.
Amen.
We met them on a bus, a double-decker bus, to be more accurate. Mark, the dad, had just come up to the second level of the double-decker we were sitting in, and across from the aisle we heard him explain to his college-age daughter Joy that he had mistakenly bought round-trip tickets. And the bus driver, however, was very nice and refunded them half of their tickets. Now this struck Becky, Rowan, and I as odd, as we were on the only bus across the Isle of Mull toward the ferry to Iona. It's pretty odd to go one way in that direction. Even if you're staying for a week or two, you're going to buy a round trip. It's cheaper to do that. So we began inquiring about Mark and Joy. They come from the Carolinas, that place that holds our prayers these days, and they were about to engage in pilgrimage. Pilgrims were they, planning to leave Iona after 2 days there to walk across not only the 2-hour landscape that it took for us to get over in a bus across Mull, but then the other some 150 miles to St. Andrews on the other side of the mainland of Scotland. They were following the ancient route of St. Columba, the St. Columba Way. And in hearing about them, then we got quite connected, and they actually sent us an email some 1.5 months later, when we heard back that they had indeed successfully made it to St. Andrews. But in that email they said St. Andrews, of course, was not the destination, but truly being together as father and daughter in this very unique stage in life. And Mark sent me an email with lots of joy about that trip and about the power of journey. Now, if you had the unenviable task of summarizing the whole canon of Scripture into one word, and you can't say love, what kind of word might you choose? It can't be journey, I just gave you journey. It's sort of an impossible task, but I wonder if we could suggest the word Exodus. Exodus, of course, requires movement, it requires a journey. And throughout the biblical narrative, we hear about Exodus journeying that is rooted in liberation, freedom, and injustice, an end to tyranny, fear, and violence. And when we hear that word Exodus, let's not just think about Pharaoh and the plagues, but to think back to Genesis, in the beginning, when the cosmos was set free with vitality, where everything was created in the image of the very Creator. Exodus is also the story of Abram and Sarai that we heard so well read this morning from Faith Perry. Thank you, Faith. That text that begins with God saying to those two from the land of Ur, go. Go from your country, your kindred, your parents' house, to a land that I will show you. God says go, and they go. From the earliest Genesis stories, we hear about this desire of God wanting people to be on the move to freedom. In this movement, there is provision, there is divine protection. Flip through those psalms that are replete with references to refuge, to shelter. God is my refuge, my rock, my redeemer, my liberator. God is my portion, my cup, my salvation along the way. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. As pilgrims along, as we journey along life's valleys, highways, and byways, God is there with provision and protection. Of course, the theme of Exodus courses through our Gospels as well. So you hear Jesus healing, forgiving, challenging, upsetting, setting free by turning over the tables of capitalism, exploitation, bullying, hypocrisy, violence, and fear. And in today's well-known story from Mark 6, Jesus is again on the move. While our ears often locate mostly to the loaves and fishes in this incredible story, let's recall how it begins. It begins with a boat. Jesus, exhausted from ministry and perhaps stunned and still grieving over the recent execution of his friend John the Baptizer, he gets into a coracle. He gets into a boat in search of a quiet, deserted place to be alone with the closest of his followers. Of course, crowds see him go, and they go along the shore to meet him there. I can imagine how crestfallen he may have been when they first got there. But he's filled with compassion in seeing those who seek him. But recall in this story, there is no wild provision of loaves and fishes without first an exodus, without pilgrimage. We recall the earliest descriptors used for the emergent group of Jesus' followers in the first century was the way. All who follow the itinerant one who is born on the move, poor in a forgotten transitional animal shed, later becomes the one who has nowhere to lay his head. All who follow this Christ are known as people of the way. Journeyers, itinerants, voyagers, wanderers, wayfaring strangers, pilgrims. We who follow, too, are people of the movement. We describe our Christian journey, indeed, as a journey of faith. A journey that makes love possible, for love, the active verb, a practice that always involves movement. We getting closer to someone, we getting closer to God, closer to the earth. Love requires us to move. As long as there is a need for liberation, for exodus, there will be a need for pilgrimage. What images come to our mind when we hear that word? Pilgrimage. Here in New England, we may be located with Thanksgiving and black shoes with golden buckles and fluffy white collars and tall hats, also with buckles. We're moving past our local history memories of that colonial, connected, religious freedom-seeking movement. We can think a little bit more broadly. In the religious context, we may think of John Bunyan's A Pilgrim's Progress, pilgrimage as a journey with spiritual significance. We may think of Islam and Mecca, Jerusalem and Judaism, the Camino del Santiago and Christianity. Some of you I know have walked that. My aunt and uncle, Mark Smith, I know, Stacey Swain, Beth Wyman, or St. Columba's Way of Joy and Mark's journey in Scotland. Other treks that have deep spiritual resonance. Tim and Betsy, I know you hiked the West Highland Way in Scotland. Thea, I know you're here. You just walked the Scottish National Trail, some 500 miles across Scotland. In all of these walks for spiritual significance, walks for exercise, walks for joy, walks for spiritual and social justice, like the interreligious pilgrimage for the earth. All of these pilgrimages inquire and require us to move. They speak of a need for liberation, whether we are doing these for a whole variety of reasons, perhaps to give thanksgiving, recognizing that all good gifts around us come from God, perhaps in the deep spiritual Christian tradition of penance, of asking for forgiveness, of making amends. Many people walk and to go on pilgrimage to do that. Taking stock of one's life, seeing new places, being inspired by new landscapes, listening deeply to the invitation to keep Sabbath, being inspired by this idea of liberation. I am grateful again to say that on our sabbatical we had such an opportunity to practice in pilgrimage in a small way, moving our bodies, but in a big way, moving our minds and our hearts by going to Iona for that week in Scotland. It's as if we heard the words of Jesus to his disciples in today's reading from Mark, "Come away with me to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." Iona feels like a deserted place in the most beautiful sense of the word. It's an ancient solitary hunk of rock that lies just west of the Scottish mainland. It's a Hebridean island 4 miles long by 1 mile wide that speaks of Exodus. In its ancient geological history, it speaks of movement as it was once part of North America, in that supercontinent known as Pangaea, that pre-Cambrian, 3-something billion-year-old rock that is connected there is what we find in Nova Scotia here. They were connected and they have now moved, and they continue to move. Iona speaks of movement not just geologically, but also spiritually. It is the place of course, St. Columba, that Celtic figure of great regard and lore who embodied movement and pilgrimage. Columba's name is the same meaning of the Hebrew name Jonah, dove. And it was through the actions of this Irish monk who came like a dove to Iona in 563 of the Common Era, who is credited with the movement of Christianity from Ireland to Scotland and then beyond, preserving, most importantly, this idea of a Celtic understanding of faith. St. Columba traveled to Iona in a coracle. It's the same name that the modern-day Iona community gives to its monthly magazine. A coracle is similar to the so-called bull boats often in the past here known in the Plains Indians traditions, made of bison hides stretched over bendable branches. Columbus' coracle instead was made out of oxen hides stretched over a wicker and hazel frame, but perhaps a bit larger, one that could hold about 12 passengers that he traveled with sails and oars from Ireland to Scotland. There's much lore in this idea of coracle. There in the Iona Abbey, just to the left of the communion table, is a replica of this coracle and sails. This idea of journey and connection to nourishment in the sacraments of communion. The reason why Columba left Ireland are varied and covered in many accounts, but range from being banished from Ireland because of a copyright infringement in copying some Celtic manuscripts that he was not supposed to, which then resulted in a small battle where actually people died, and so he was banished to seek penance, to go to Scotland and to preach to the so-called pagans at that time. There's also a tradition that he was compelled to leave Ireland on his own account because of his own refusal to wear the imperial Roman monastic hairstyle, or tonsure, which is where they shave the top of their heads, in favor of the Celtic tonsure of the long hair with shaved sides. Whatever the cause, forced exile or anti-imperial protest, St. Columba's coracling has been lifted up as a major inspiration for the spiritual practice known as pilgrimage. Not just now, but even in his own time, people came to Iona to seek God's presence in a more unique way and to recognize their role in the world and seeking guidance from Columba and others on how to live their life more fully. Columba journeyed with a different sense of mission than many of his Roman Christian colleagues. Columba he called Christ his druid. He did not see Christ to be over and against the spirituality of those around him, but instead saw Christ as bringing greater fullness and vitality to all he encountered. The sacred was not to be understood located only in sanctuaries, monasteries, convents, or altars, but to be outside, in the midst of all things. St. Columba's name for God was the Lord of the elements, God primarily outside. And those high-standing crosses that came to Iona about 100 years or so after Columba's death, the St. Martin's cross being one of them, showed the centrality of outdoor worship. There were no structures to gather around that cross. The Celtic notion of movement at the heart of all things is recorded well in a compendium of oral prayers, poems, and songs as recorded from Gaelic speakers in the Highlands, compiled in the late 19th century by Alexander Carmichael, called the Carmina Gaelica. We opened ourselves in worship this morning by one of those such prayers and one of those blessings. Another one goes like this: God be with thee in every pass. Jesus be with thee on every hill. Spirit be with thee on every stream, headland, ridge, and lawn, each sea and land, each moor and meadow, each lying down, each rising up, in the trough of the waves and the crest of the billows, each step of the journey thou goest. I love that this story from Mark today, the feeding of the 5,000, takes place outside, in the midst of a journey. Not in a so-called sanctuary inside, but the larger sanctuary that John Calvin described as the theater of God's glory, all of nature. For this gospel story helps us make that connection that is precisely in the journey when nourishment appears. Whether due to the power of community inspired by the generosity of a few who first gave those 5 loaves and 2 fish, or simply the miraculous presence of the one who lived his life in compassion and love, this story is about the promise of nourishment that is associated with the presence of Christ along the way. The power of community and generosity is seen profoundly right now in the Carolinas, where there is a need for prayer, where there is a need for reaching out. I was struck by a story of Trey Tillman in North Carolina, who found himself a boat. He was 26. He found himself a boat. He got into that boat and he started rescuing people early on Friday, and continues, I'm sure, through this weekend as he joins a flotilla of volunteers to reach out, to get into coracles and help others find safety. We saw that here in our own neighborhood in the Merrimack Valley this week as tragic explosions from the fossil fuel economy took over our landscape. People helped each other and invited them into their homes, strangers sleeping with one another on couches in hallways to stay out of danger's way. Celtic scholar Esther DeWall, in her book, The Celtic Way of Prayer, a staple for Rebecca Rowan and I in our Celtic Family Way sabbatical, writes about a Celtic concept called peregrinatio, a journey that involves the elements of seeking, quest, adventure, wandering, and exile. Now, peregrinatio is a Latin word that is unique to Celtic Christianity, but it's pretty untranslatable. So she offers up this story of a 9th century story of these three pilgrims who left Ireland in coracles with no oar and no sails. And they drifted by the currents for 7 days and finally came ashore in Cornwall, England, and were brought to the court of King Alfred, who then asked them, where are they coming from and where are they going? And their answer was, we stole away because we wanted, for the love of God, to be on pilgrimage, we cared not where. This Celtic understanding of pilgrimage, of being in the destination and not concerned with the destination, being in the journey and not being concerned with the destination, is this embodiment of peregrinatio, the journey for the love of Christ. The Celts saw themselves as hospitis mundi, guests of the world, and what they were seeking was the place of their own resurrection. The resurrected self, the true self in Christ. For it is this true self which is true home. As the old Irish poem goes, to Rome I go in much trouble. Little of profit will it be. The king whom thou seekest there, unless thou bring him with thee, thou wilt not find. If we don't journey in the presence of God, we're not going to find the presence of God. This is that Iona and this Celtic idea of pilgrimage in peregrinatio. Iona is a place of pilgrimage, and I was so grateful to have a full day of pilgrimage while we were there to join John Philip Newell to walk the island from morning till evening. And for the whole week we were on Iona, it was sunny, beautiful, a blue sky day until the morning of Wednesday when we woke up to a massive storm and gray clouds and sideways rain. It was perfect. It was a perfect environment to walk on pilgrimage in that place, to walk the islands, to get drenched, and to be reminded of standing firm. It was on that walk that I learned that Ghanaian song, or that Cameroonian song that we're singing now in worship, Stand Firm, where we were taught that by Ali Newell in the midst of the rain, stand firm, in the midst of the element, in the midst of the waves, in the midst of the uncertainty of life, stand firm and remember God's presence. On that pilgrimage, we walked to St. Columba's Bay, the associated bay with where Columba and his followers first landed. And if you look at your bulletin today, you'll see a picture of a stole that I had commissioned while I was there on Iona by Ruth Duck. And she has made this stole, Ruth Duck, not the worship leader. We're talking about Ruth Black, the seam maker. She hand wove the stole that I'm wearing today. And a picture of it is on the front of your bulletin. It depicts the St. Martin's Cross of Iona and the Celtic knots, the anchor, and on one side you see the Coracle with St. Columba. Again, a powerful reminder of the invitation to journey. On the back of the stole, there's the Mackay clan tartan, reminding myself of my own family roots, reminding perhaps all of us that we are part of the story of movement and the story of liberation. Pilgrimage as sacrament. I love that today we again gather around the sacrament table, the Eucharist, the communion, God's supper. We gather at this place, reminding us of the outward and visible sign of the inward spiritual grace that comes through and because of our remembrance of what Christ is in our lives, in our hearts, and in our world. As we do so, I invite us into that question of what might we be invited to pilgrim along with this coming year. If you are being called to a pilgrimage, if you have the resources and opportunities like we did to get to go to Scotland, I encourage you to avail yourself of such an opportunity. Most of us don't have that opportunity of a sabbatical. Most of us may not have the ability to go for a long walk in the bodies that we have at this time in our lives, but all of us are invited to the way of pilgrimage, the way of movement and liberation. Whether we are sitting, whether we are moving, we are part of God's movement in our world. So I invite us to think about what we might be being invited into? How might we be called to find our resurrected self? Are we being invited into the land of forgiveness? Are there past hurts that we carry with us that cry out for more liberation? Are we being called into the sea of reconciliation? Is there someone who's getting under your skin? Do you need to make right with that person before you come to the communion table? Thank you, Matthew 25. Or are we called into the heathered moor of relationship repair? Is there someone that has fallen out of relationship with you that you long to be back in connection with? Is God calling us into these ways, into these landscapes this coming year? If so, let us remind ourselves that God, the rock, the Redeemer, is present with us, even as the waves surround sometimes our small coracles. Let us get in those, friends. We are people on the way. Whether there are oars or sails in our boat, there is trust that will carry us along the currents of life. As we move, let us sing Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Life is indeed tempestuous, unknown waves before us roll, but chart and compass come from thee, Jesus, Savior, pilot us. Our prayer as we continue in worship, as we sing, and as we continue to journey in our lives, may it be so.